brought this upon yourselves!
No, please! Have mercy! Stop him!
On the night the sky broke open over Mississippi, the old smokehouse at the edge of Whitmore Plantation shook like a trapped animal. Thunder rolled low over the cotton fields, crawling across the dark horizon, and lightning tore brief, violent windows into the world outside. In those white-hot flashes, anyone looking toward the little stone building would have seen a figure chained to the back wall, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest and the faint, steady movement of his eyes. His name was Tobias. For 7 years, he had been anchored to that wall like a piece of forgotten equipment, irons circling his wrists, his ankles, his throat. 7 years of mornings that began with the smell of hot metal and the sound of footsteps on the packed dirt floor. 7 years of listening to the iron hiss against his skin, of hearing his own flesh sear and crackle like meat dropped on a pan. 7 years of learning the sound of pain so well it had become another language. Tonight, for the first time, his chains were almost ready to break. Outside, the storm gathered itself with the slow inevitability of judgment. The wind moved through the trees, bending the branches of the oaks that lined the road like they were bowing to some unseen procession. Rain began as a few scattered drops and then thickened into a curtain, turning the yard into a blur of movement and shadow. The plantation house glowed like a ship in a dark sea, lamplight in the windows flickering each time the wind shoved against the glass. In the parlor of that house, 5 white men drank whiskey and laughed over a game of cards, their voices rising and falling in rough, easy patterns. They were the overseers of Whitmore Plantation, men whose hands and minds had been sharpened by years of controlling other human beings. A bolt of lightning flashed across their faces through the tall front windows. Samuel Briggs, Marcus Cole, William Frost, James Porter, Thomas Nash, each of them carrying, somewhere in his memory, the sound of Tobias's screams. They did not know that, on this night, those screams were almost over. In the smokehouse, the storm's growl seeped through the cracks in the stone and warped wooden door, mingling with the familiar smells of soot, old blood, and scorched skin that never quite faded. Tobias stood as straight as the chains would allow, his shoulders drawn back, his head slightly bowed, as if he were listening for a judgment only he could hear. His body wore 7 years like a map. Scars crossed his back in twisted rivers. Burned letters and numbers marked his chest and forehead. The brands layered on top of each other, until the original patterns blurred. There was no part of him that had not been touched by heat, by whip, by fist, or boot, or iron. To an outside eye, he might have looked broken beyond repair. Skin knotted and puckered, muscles stiffened and half-wasted from long confinement. Hands scarred where he had rubbed the turn, iron links, until his flesh split open. But his eyes were different. They were steady, focused, alive in a way that did not belong in this small hell. In those eyes lived the quiet, cold thing that 7 years of pain had not been able to kill. Hope had died in him a dozen times and risen again in another form, harder and less forgiving each time. Whatever softness he had once carried a young man's dreams of escape, of somewhere north where a person with his skin could walk unchained, had long since burned away. What remained in Tobias now was not hope, it was purpose. A gust of wind hammered the door, and dust fell from the ceiling beams. The iron at his wrists rattled. He tested the movement again, almost absently, the way a man might check the loose tooth of an old key. The motion was so small that anyone watching would have thought it meaningless, a minor shift of tired limbs. But he knew, with the intimate knowledge that comes from endless repetition, that the link nearest his right wrist was nearly finished. For years, Tobias had learned the rhythm of metal. He knew how iron sounded when it was heated to branding heat, a high, thin song only his memory heard now. He knew the weight of the branding iron when it rested in a man's hand, knew the difference between a steady grip and a careless one. He had memorized the way the chain links creaked when he twisted his hands just so. The long, slow complaint of strained metal, the faint, gritty whisper of something beginning to crack. Tonight, under the roar of the storm, the complaint of that link was a private confession in his ear. Another flash of lightning split the sky and poured through the tiny, barred window high on the smokehouse wall, throwing everything into sharp black and white for the span of a breath. In that moment, Tobias's shadow leaped across the stone, long and strange, a gaunt figure with arms lifted just enough to suggest movement. Then, the darkness closed over him again, and only the dull glimmer of the chain showed faintly in the gloom. In the main house, a burst of laughter rose above the thunder. Briggs slammed a card onto the table, his heavy hand making the glassware tremble. Cole reached for the bottle, topping off everyone's drink with generous, careless motions of a man who felt entirely safe. Porter leaned back in his chair, boots crossed at the ankle, enjoying the storm like a show put on for his entertainment. If any of them thought about Tobias at all, it was only as a distant object, a problem long since contained, a lesson nailed to a wall. 7 years earlier, they had watched him bleed in the yard after the slave catchers dragged him back from his failed escape. 7 years earlier, they had seen the look in his eyes as Master Whitmore pronounced his sentence. Chained for 7 years, branded daily, made into a living example. They had assumed, as men in their position always did, that the human spirit had a breaking point. That, with enough iron, enough fire, enough pain, even the strongest man would shatter. And perhaps Tobias had shattered, but he had not stayed in pieces. The storm outside was not the first to pass over Whitmore Plantation during his captivity. There had been others hard summer storms that rose out of nowhere, winter rains that soaked through wood and cloth and bone. From his place on the wall, Tobias had listened to each one, counting the time between flashes and thunder, learning how loud the sky could be when it wanted to hide smaller sounds. He had watched how the men moved when the weather turned violent, how the overseers drew closer to the main house, how the other slaves hurried to secure the animals and tools and then vanished into their cabins as soon as they could. Storms changed things. They made careless men more careless. They made cautious men hurry. They made the world outside his stone room feel, for a few hours, as chaotic as his own mind. For 7 years, he had waited for a storm that felt like this one. The air had been strange all day. Even through the smokehouse walls, Tobias had felt it a heavy, pressed feeling, as if the sky were leaning down on the fields. The usual sounds of the plantation had carried differently, dampened and hollow. The animals had grown restless. Somewhere before dusk, a chain of low, distant thunder began to roll over the horizon, too far away to be threatening yet, but steady enough to promise that it was coming. As the afternoon darkened early and the first strong winds arrived, the overseers made their choice. They had gone to the big house. Tobias had heard their voices moving across the yard, heard the short exchange of orders, the hurried footsteps of slaves sent to secure shutters and bring in tools. Then the sound of the overseers' boots faded toward the main building, where light, warmth, and whiskey waited. The correction facility, the ironic name Master Whitmore had given this, repurposed. Smokehouse fell quiet, except for the rising wind and the occasional slap of rain beginning to strike the door. Alone, for once, truly alone. In the beginning, solitude had been another lash. The early years of Tobias's sentence had been filled with hours that stretched without end, broken only by the daily visits of the men with the iron. Time was a slow drip then, each minute stretching into something that felt unbearable. He had thought, in those first months, that the loneliness would drive him mad. No faces but his tormentors, no voices but theirs and his own hoarse cries. But over the years, silence had become something else. Dangerous men learn to think when no one is watching. He had learned how to fold his thoughts in on themselves, how to move ideas around slowly and carefully, like stones in a pocket. He had learned to watch, to listen, to measure. He had learned that he could use the stillness inside the smokehouse the way other men used a table somewhere, to lay things out, to examine them from every angle, to plan. Now, that same silence held its breath around him as the storm solidified overhead. Another roll of thunder, closer now, shook a thin line of dust from the rafters. The chain at his wrist trembled faintly. Tobias shifted his weight, driving his heels into the packed dirt floor, tightening every muscle down his spine and through his shoulders. The weakened link protested, A faint, sharp whisper inside the broader rattle of iron. Not yet, he told himself, though no sound left his lips. He could have broken it already. A harder jerk, a less careful moment of strain on a quieter night, and the link would have given way. But 7 years in chains had taught him that the difference between escape and another beating was often timing. The world outside needed to be as loud and blind as possible. The men who might catch a glimpse of movement or hear the crack of metal needed to be distracted, drunk, relaxed. So he waited. Let the storm ripen. Let the sky make its own noise first. In the main house, another round of laughter burst out. A chair scraped. A glass fell and shattered, followed by Porter's crude joke about accidents and weak hands. Cards slapped wood. Somewhere, a servant's footsteps passed faintly down the hall and then were gone. None of them imagined that a man who had been chained for 7 years could still be dangerous. In their minds, chains were more than iron. They were destiny. A person who had been bound that long, burned that often, starved and beaten and deprived of sleep, could not still have the strength to fight, much less to plan. They did not understand what 7 years of pain could build inside a human being. They did not understand that Tobias's chains had not only held him, they had honed him. Outside, the rain became a roar. The wind keened through the gaps between the smokehouse stones, a high, wild sound that threaded itself through the low thunder. The first flash, of lightning that struck close enough to feel, lit the room with such sudden brightness that the scars on Tobias's chest glowed pale against his dark skin. His eyes flicked to the window. The storm was here. Slowly, with the calm of a man who has repeated an action 10,000 times in his mind before doing it once with his body, Tobias drew in a long breath. The chain at his right wrist lay across his forearm like a coiled snake, the weakened link resting exactly where he needed it to be. Another flash, another crash of thunder, so loud it felt like the sky itself was breaking. In that instant, as sound and light collided over Whitmore Plantation, Tobias moved. Long before the storm and the broken chains, there had been the slow rhythm of cotton and heat. The Whitmore Plantation, sprawling over hundreds of acres near Natchez, Mississippi, was a world of ritualized suffering. Every dawn, the horn sounded from the veranda of the main house, and the enslaved people filed out from their cabins, their breath forming pale ghosts in the early mist. The overseers rode their horses through the rows, calling names and shouting orders. The air smelled of dew and dirt and fear. Tobias had been born into that rhythm. His mother, Clara, had been a field hand who died before he turned 9. His father, if he existed in any official sense, had been nothing more than a whispered rumor among the older women. The plantation records listed Tobias simply as male, property of Whitmore Estate, born 1825. For the first 25 years of his life, that line was the only document the world held of his existence. But Tobias had always carried more within him than the lines written by another man's hand. He had a sharpness in his gaze, a restless fire that made some of the older slaves uneasy. He listened more than he spoke, and he remembered everything: names, times, small cruelties that others forgot in order to survive. He had been trusted with small jobs near the main house, tending fires, polishing tools, carrying messages. These small tasks had given him glimpses of the world beyond the cotton rows, of books and papers and language. It was the books that changed everything. One afternoon, while sweeping the hallway near the library, Tobias found a scrap of paper torn from a Bible. The words simple, printed, and miraculous called to him like water to a dying man. He traced them with his finger again and again until he could reproduce their shapes in the dirt outside his cabin. The housemaid, a kind, weary woman named Ruth, caught him doing it one evening. Instead of reporting him, she showed him the rest of the alphabet, drawn with a stick in the mud. From that moment, Tobias's hunger for knowledge became a quiet rebellion. He learned to read in stolen fragments, pieced together from old sermons, discarded newspapers, and brief whispers exchanged after dark. He devoured words the way others devoured food. By 20, he could read. fluently enough to understand the notices tacked to the wall at the general store. Slave auctions, reward posters, escape notices. He read of freedom in places like Ohio and Pennsylvania. He read of the Underground Railroad, of men and women who defied laws older than their lifetimes. And as he read, something in him began to grow that could no longer be contained within Whitmore's walls. Freedom became not an idea, but an obsession. For years, Tobias planned, quietly, patiently. He gathered scraps of information from travelers, from whispering field hands, from old men who remembered escape routes. He hid small pieces of food and bits of cloth beneath the floor of his cabin. He carved a hollow into the leg of his cot to hold a few coins stolen from the overseer's laundry. Every night, when the plantation fell into silence, he stared at the faint light of the North Star through the cracks in his cabin wall. He imagined following it until it led him to a world where a man could breathe without asking permission. Then came the spring of 1850, the year that would split his life into two halves, before and after. That March, word spread through the cabins that a new patrol had been formed. Men paid to hunt down escapees, armed and mounted, ruthless in their pursuit. Tobias listened, calculating. He knew the danger, but he also knew that the window for escape never stayed open long. Slaves who waited for perfect timing often died waiting. On a humid Sunday night, he ran. The moon was thin, barely more than a curved blade of light. Tobias moved through the rows, silent as breath, past the barns and smokehouses, past the slave quarters, where faint snoring and murmured dreams filled the night air. He carried nothing but a small satchel of food, a flint, and a strip of cloth he used to tie his feet to muffle his steps. He had memorized the patrol routes, timed the intervals of their rounds, and calculated the gaps between their crossings. When he reached the edge of the property and stepped into the darkness of the forest, he felt something in his chest loosen for the first time in his life. Freedom was not a shout. It was a heartbeat. For 3 days, Tobias traveled north through the swamps and pine woods, guided by the faint gleam of the North Star. He drank from muddy pools, slept in hollow logs, and moved only by night. On the 3rd day, as dawn broke, he crossed a narrow stream and climbed a ridge. The world seemed endless from up there. The air was cool, untouched by the plantation's stink of sweat and blood. He whispered a prayer to no one in particular. For the first time, Tobias believed he might live long enough to see another kind of life. But freedom, for an enslaved man in Mississippi, was always a fragile thing, an ember carried through the wind. At sunrise on the 4th day, he heard the dogs. Their howls cut through the forest like a blade, distant but unmistakable. He ran. The sound grew louder, closer, hungrier. By the time he reached the next stretch of swamp, the baying had turned into a chorus. His lungs burned, his legs felt heavy as stone. But still he ran through the mud, through the thorns, through water that rose to his knees. When the dogs reached him, he tried to fight. One bit into his leg, another leapt for his arm, dragging him down into the mire. Then came the men, the patrol faces red from the chase, rifles gleaming with morning dew. They beat him until the world went white. He awoke in the wagon, bound hand and foot, blood dried into his clothes. The men laughed and joked as if they had caught a wild animal. Tobias stared up at the sky, now a hard blue without clouds. He tried to memorize it, that last image of open air before the world closed in on him again. When they dragged him through the plantation gates, Master Whitmore was waiting. He was not a large man, but cruelty had given him stature. His thin face, lined with petty rage, was almost calm. As he stepped forward to look down at Tobias. "Well," he said, "the reading slave returns." Those words, more than the whip, broke something inside Tobias. 7 years, Whitmore declared. 7 years chained in the old smokehouse. 7 years of instruction under the overseer's care. The men Briggs, Cole, Frost, Porter, and Nash stood nearby, smirking, their eyes bright with anticipation. From that day on, Tobias ceased to be a man in their eyes. He became an experiment. The smokehouse where they chained him was small, built of rough stone that held the heat like an oven in summer and the cold like a tomb in winter. The air was thick with the smell of charred wood and iron. His collar was fastened to a ring embedded in the wall. Each morning, an overseer entered carrying the branding iron, glowing red from the forge. The hiss and the scream that followed became as regular as the sound of the bell announcing sunrise. The scars multiplied shoulders, chest, legs. But what the overseers did not know was that every burn, every mark, was teaching Tobias something. He was learning the texture of iron, how long it took to cool, how the weight shifted when lifted, how pain could be delayed or redirected. The same tool they used to break him became the one that would eventually free him. In the long silence between their visits, he studied the world through sound. The creak of boots outside told him who approached. The cadence of their laughter revealed which one carried the iron, which one preferred the whip. He memorized every voice, every step, every sigh. Briggs was heavy, deliberate. Cole's boots scuffed, betraying his nerves. Frost hummed when he worked. Porter whistled after inflicting pain, as if it pleased him. Nash's steps were hurried, eager, uncertain. In that monotony of cruelty, Tobias's mind sharpened like the edge of a blade. Pain was a teacher, patience its only ally. The years blurred, but his purpose did not. He learned to sleep standing, to move his arms within the limits of the chains without drawing notice, to measure time by the rhythm of his own heartbeat. Every link in the chain, every echo of their boots became part of his plan. By the time his body was a canvas of scars, Tobias had stopped being the slave they thought they had broken. He had become something else, an observer hidden behind the mask of obedience. A man who understood that survival was not the same as surrender. And somewhere deep inside him, in the quiet place where pain and purpose met, he began to whisper to himself, 7 years, 7 years. Then the iron burns again, but not me. The world outside changed, seasons turned, overseers aged. Storms came and went, but Tobias's eyes remained fixed on a horizon no one else could see. The chain at his wrist weakened, grain by grain. The will within him hardened, day by day. In the distance, the cotton fields swayed in the wind, white as bone under the bean, Mississippi sun. And somewhere beyond those fields lay the storm that would set him free. The first year of Tobias's captivity became a study in pain. By design, it was a system of degradation so total that even the most resilient spirit would bend beneath its weight. The small stone smokehouse once used for preserving meat had been transformed into what Master Whitmore called the correction room, a place meant to demonstrate the plantation's authority. The overseers took pride in its efficiency. Inside, the air was perpetually heavy with the scent of burnt flesh and the ghost of smoke, as though the walls themselves had absorbed the agony of those who had passed through. Each morning, just after dawn, Tobias heard the same sequence: the creak of the outer latch, the scrape of boots on dirt, and the metallic hiss of the brand being drawn from the forge. The sound of heated iron against air was unlike any other. It sang in the space between life and death, a whisper of fire that promised ruin. Samuel Briggs, the head overseer, always entered first. His figure filled the doorway like a shadow too large to belong to any ordinary man. He was a mountain of muscle and cruelty, with arms thick from years of swinging whips and irons. "Morning lesson, boy," Briggs would say, his voice calm, almost conversational. The branding iron in his hand glowed a terrible orange, the color of sunset on a battlefield. Tobias would stand chained to the wall, wrists and ankles bound, neck collared to the iron ring. He had learned early that resistance only prolonged the inevitable. Still, he did not scream at once. He saved his voice. Each time the iron kissed his flesh, he bit the inside of his cheek until blood filled his mouth, until he could taste the copper tang that reminded him he was still human, still more than the pain they wished to reduce him to. The others soon followed. Marcus Cole, young and sharp-featured, with eyes that glittered like glass marbles, handled cruelty like a mathematician handled equations. He enjoyed conversation during his tortures, asking questions that had no answers. "Tell me, Tobias." He'd murmur while pressing the iron an inch from the slave's skin. "Why does a man who can read think he can outrun his own nature?" Tobias said nothing, because silence was his only defense. Each word risked betrayal of pain, of anger, of thought, and he had vowed never to give them that satisfaction again. William Frost was the philosopher among them, the self-appointed intellectual. His fascination lay not in the physical act but in the theory of suffering. He saw his victims as material for experimentation. Sometimes he brought multiple irons, each engraved with symbols or letters, to study the difference in pain response depending on the shape of the metal. "The spiral," he once said, holding a freshly forged tool with a curl at its end, "creates a pattern that lasts longer in the skin. Pain, Tobias, is a teacher. It teaches obedience." James Porter, older and crueler, found beauty in unpredictability. He preferred spontaneity, striking without rhythm, laughing between screams. He was the only one who did not speak during his sessions. He simply watched, breathing heavily, his lips parted in the shadow of a smile. And then there was Thomas Nash, the youngest, barely 21, in another life. Perhaps he could have been gentle, but power had corrupted him early, and fear of seeming weak among the other men turned him savage. His punishments were erratic, driven by desperation to impress. Tobias noticed that his hands sometimes trembled before he raised the iron, that his eyes darted to the others for approval. Those small signs told Tobias what years later would matter most, that Nash's cruelty came not from strength, but from insecurity. Together, these 5 men formed a machinery of torment so precise it could have been engineered. Their visits rotated like clockwork. Briggs on Mondays, Cole on Tuesdays, Frost on Wednesdays, Porter on Thursdays, Nash on Fridays. Saturdays were for collective amusement. All 5 gathered to watch and compete, each trying to elicit the most memorable reaction. Sunday was the only day of silence, the Sabbath reserved for worship, a dark irony that Tobias never missed. He often listened from the smokehouse to the hymns floating from the chapel, wondering what God they prayed to, what scripture justified their hands. The physical agony was relentless. The brands bit into his skin until the surface of his body became an archive of suffering letters, numbers, symbols. They burned the word property across his back, the letter S for slave, into his forehead. On his chest, the year 1850 stood as a permanent memorial to his failed escape. Over time, the wounds layered so thickly that new scars folded into old ones, erasing the distinction between past and present pain. But the real battle took place behind Tobias's eyes. Briggs wanted him broken, Cole wanted him humiliated, Frost wanted him enlightened, Porter wanted him screaming, and Nash wanted him submissive. Every day they worked toward the same goal: to erase the person within the body, to strip the mind until nothing remained but instinct and obedience. They wanted to make him forget that he had ever dreamed of the North Star, that he had ever believed in words or hope or freedom. They failed. In the endless monotony of pain, Tobias discovered something extraordinary. The human mind, when stripped of everything, begins to rebuild itself in secret. He learned to retreat inward, to a place the iron could not reach. Each lash, each burn, became a metronome, marking time for his thoughts. He began to observe his captors as one might study predators, not with fear, but with precision. He noticed that Briggs, despite his strength, tired easily in the heat. Sweat made his grip slippery, his aim careless. Cole liked to talk so much that he often forgot to secure Tobias's left wrist after a session. Frost's pride in his artistry made him slow, distracted by his own explanations. Porter leaned in too close, intoxicated by his cruelty. Nash left tools unguarded when nervous. These were details, small as dust, but dust, collected over time, becomes weight. Tobias stored them all in the secret chambers of his mind. When the pain became too much, he focused on the sound of the rain outside or the rhythm of his own breathing. Sometimes he repeated fragments of scripture Ruth had once whispered to him. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Over years, the words lost their religious meaning but gained something harder: discipline. They became a mantra for endurance. Seasons changed, marked by the smell of different air through the cracks of the smokehouse wall. Spring brought pollen and faint birdsong. Summer, a choking heat that turned his burns raw again. Autumn, the sweet rot of fallen leaves. Winter, the biting cold that made his skin crack and bleed. He endured them all, patient as stone. By the third year, Tobias no longer counted days. He measured time by the weakness in the chains. The iron links, once perfect, had begun to rust from the humidity and from his own subtle efforts. He discovered that by twisting his wrists a certain way, slowly, repeatedly, he could grind the links against each other, wearing them down grain by grain. The overseers, careless in their arrogance, never checked closely. To them, the idea that he might be planning anything was unthinkable. One night, when Briggs forgot to lock the door fully, Tobias managed to glance through the small gap at the moonlight beyond the yard. He saw the fields stretching endlessly into silver, the trees trembling in the wind. For a brief moment, he breathed air that hadn't passed through stone first. It was enough to remind him why he was alive. By the fourth year, the overseer's cruelty had begun to turn inward. Boredom had settled over them. Tobias's stoicism infuriated them precisely because it denied them satisfaction. Briggs hit harder. Frost carved patterns with heated wire. Porter began inventing games, wagering how long Tobias would stay conscious. Nash, desperate to prove himself, inflicted punishment twice in one day. Yet, with each new cruelty, Tobias grew quieter, calmer, more deliberate. He became an absence, a mirror in which they saw their own ugliness reflected back. Sometimes they taunted him about the others on the plantation. "They don't remember you," Cole said once, sneering. "You're just a ghost chained to a wall. They've moved on." But Tobias knew better. In the rare moments when he heard the distant voices of the enslaved passing outside, there were murmurs, brief, half-fearful words spoken in code. The chained man still lives. The knowledge that others still whispered his name was a hidden ember in his heart. Then came the fifth year, and something shifted. Frost's intellectual cruelty had turned to obsession. He began experimenting with multiple irons, pressing them into Tobias's flesh in symmetrical designs. "You see," he told the younger overseers, "this man is no longer a human being. He's an archive of lessons. Each scar represents a truth about order and punishment." Tobias listened, memorizing every movement, every gesture. The more they talked, the more he learned. By the end of that year, he understood not only their habits but their fears, the things they hid even from each other. Briggs feared aging. Cole feared being mocked. Frost feared irrelevance. Porter feared silence. Nash feared being alone. In those fears, Tobias saw his path forward. The iron had taught him everything he needed to know about their hands, their rhythms, their weaknesses. The chains had taught him patience. The pain had taught him precision. What remained was time. By the sixth year, he had loosened one of the wall rings enough that it wobbled faintly when pulled. He knew that, with the right leverage and the right noise outside thunder, perhaps it could break free. The notion gave him strength. He no longer viewed the chains as barriers but as materials metal that would someday serve him. When Nash entered one afternoon, trembling as he brought the iron close to Tobias's chest, Tobias's eyes locked on the younger man's trembling hand. For the first time in 7 years, Tobias smiled not with warmth, but with knowledge. Nash recoiled, unnerved. He could not explain why, but in that moment, he felt as if the prisoner were no longer the one chained to the wall. The balance of power had begun to tilt. Tobias said nothing. He didn't need to. The storm he waited for both inside and outside was coming. He could smell it in the air when the wind shifted. He could feel it in the faint vibration of the chains. 7 years of cruelty had forged something in him that was neither slave nor man, but a weapon tempered by fire and silence. The overseers thought they had built a monument to obedience. They had built their own destruction. By the dawn of Tobias's 5th year in chains, the boundaries between man and weapon had blurred. He no longer thought of himself as the boy who once dreamed of running north or finding a home beyond the cotton fields. That Tobias, the young man who had believed in hope, who had once read scripture by candlelight in secret, had long since burned away, replaced by something forged in flame and silence. The overseers believed they still held dominion over him, but what they saw each day, the still body, the dull stare, the quiet compliance, was only a shell. Beneath the surface, his mind was sharpening itself against the whetstone of their cruelty. Every insult, every strike of the iron, every moment of humiliation had become material for study. He examined his captors the way a hunter examines his prey, observing their routines, their habits, and, most of all, their weaknesses. Each of the 5 men had his own signature cruelty. Tobias could identify them by sound alone. Briggs's footsteps were heavy, measured. His boots sank into the earth with a rhythm that mirrored his authority. He was the leader not because he was the cleverest, but because he was the most brutal, the kind of man who mistook fear for respect. He spoke rarely, preferring gestures and blows to words. But Tobias noticed the details others missed. How Briggs's breathing grew heavier as the day progressed, how his hands trembled faintly by afternoon, and how he favored his left leg after long hours on horseback. Marcus Cole was the opposite, fast-talking, calculating, cruel in ways that required language. He liked to remind Tobias that he could read too, that knowledge belonged to white men, not slaves. "You see these letters?" he'd say, tracing the shape of the iron before pressing it against Tobias's skin. "We write history. You are written upon." But Tobias had learned something vital from Cole's arrogance. Men who spoke too much often revealed more than they intended. From his ramblings, Tobias pieced together details about the plantation's operations, the schedules, the keys, the tools kept in the forge. Cole's voice, meant to demean, became an unwitting tutor. William Frost fancied himself an artist. His cruelty was deliberate, methodical, and aesthetic. He used pain as a form of expression, experimenting with symbols and shapes on Tobias's flesh. "Suffering is revelation," he once said, as though quoting scripture. Frost's weakness was pride. He was easily distracted by his own artistry, often leaning close to admire his work. Tobias began to anticipate the rhythm of his movements, memorizing exactly where the man placed his tools each time. He knew which side Frost turned his body on, how long he spent heating the iron, and that he sometimes forgot to lock the smokehouse door until after he had left. James Porter's sadism was simpler. He wanted fear, pure and unrefined. He struck without warning, without pattern, feeding on reaction. His weakness, Tobias realized, was his dependency on response. When Tobias stopped screaming, when he refused to give Porter the music he desired, the man's confidence faltered. "You hear me?" Porter would snarl, striking harder each time. "You hear me?" But Tobias had learned to detach himself, to drift inward until pain became distant thunder. His silence drove Porter mad. Then there was Thomas Nash, the youngest of the 5, the boy trying to be a man. His cruelty was uncertain, desperate. Tobias saw it in the way his hands shook when he lifted the iron, in the way he looked to Briggs for approval after each act. He saw it in Nash's eyes, how they lingered a second too long on the burns he created, as if he needed proof of his own power. Nash was the most dangerous, precisely because he was the least sure of himself. And yet, Tobias sensed in him the flicker of humanity that fear had not entirely smothered. He stored that observation like a weapon for later. As the seasons cycled through the plantation, Tobias began constructing an invisible architecture of knowledge. Every sound, every movement, every glance that passed between his captors became part of a larger structure in his mind. He began to time their visits precisely. Briggs always came at sunrise, Cole at mid-morning, Frost after lunch, Porter before dusk, and Nash last, when the sky was deep blue and the air smelled of cooling ash. Tobias learned that Briggs's sessions were the shortest, brutal, but efficient, while Frost's could last hours, as he lectured about discipline. He also learned to listen beyond the immediate. Through the tiny cracks in the smokehouse wall, he could hear faint echoes from the yard, the sound of horses, the shouts of field hands, the creak of wagons carrying cotton toward the river. From those noises, he learned the rhythms of the plantation. When the forge was hottest, when the workers changed shifts, when the overseers gathered to drink and boast about their work. In these sounds, Tobias heard opportunity. Every day, while they branded him, he studied the tools they used, the tongs, the poker, the branding irons. He memorized how long it took for metal to heat from dull red to white hot, how the iron changed color as it cooled, and how the smell of scorched flesh lingered for exactly 30 heartbeats before fading. He began to think of the iron not only as a symbol of pain, but as a potential instrument of retribution. The very weapon they used against him would one day be turned against them. By his 6th year, Tobias had refined his study into an exact science. He began to test the limits of his chains in secret, working each link back and forth until the iron fibers groaned softly under pressure. He had discovered that the moisture of Mississippi summers made the metal more pliable, and that by subtly shifting his weight each night, he could weaken the points near the wall where the ring was anchored. His movements were so small, so patient, that no one noticed. He used the same patience to observe the forge itself. Sometimes, when Frost or Nash arrived late, he could see through the open door the faint orange glow from the forge across the yard. He learned how long it took the coals to reach full heat. He counted the steps between the forge and the smokehouse. He noted which path the overseers took when carrying the irons. Briggs always came from the east, coal from the west. Those details, once meaningless, began to form a map. In those years of torment, Tobias became a master cartographer of suffering. He mapped not only the physical world but the mental landscape of his oppressors. He could predict Briggs's temper from the tone of his first footstep, gauge Cole's mood from his opening remark, sense Frost's boredom before the man himself realized it. But most importantly, Tobias had learned how to wait. He understood that vengeance was not born of rage, but of patience. Rage was fire, it burned bright and died quickly. Patience was iron, it could be heated, cooled, and reshaped endlessly without losing its strength. Every evening, after the overseers left and the night swallowed the plantation, Tobias stood in the darkness and listened to the world beyond his stone cell. The frogs croaked in the marsh, the wind sighed through the cypress trees, and far away, thunder sometimes rolled like a slow drumbeat across the horizon. He began to associate that sound with freedom. The storms came often in Mississippi, and with each one, Tobias imagined how the thunder could one day cover the noise of snapping chains. The other slaves still spoke of him in whispers. Though most believed he was long dead, some said his spirit remained bound to the wall, watching, waiting. The idea of Tobias had become myth, a ghost of endurance haunting the plantation. And Tobias, hearing these murmurs through the crack in his prison, smiled. A man whose name becomes a ghost cannot be killed twice. By the 7th year, Tobias's plan had solidified into something real. He would break his chains during a storm, when lightning blinded the sky and thunder drowned the sound. He would take one of the irons, his old teacher, and use it to deliver his justice. The overseers, who had each taught him a different lesson in cruelty, would now become students themselves. But before that storm came, there was a moment, a small, almost merciful fracture in the monotony that marked the true turning point. One evening, Frost entered the smokehouse alone, humming a hymn under his breath. He was drunk, his movements sloppy, his words slurred. He had come not for punishment but for gloating. "You know, Tobias," he said, leaning close, "I think you might be the greatest testament to our work. You endure, you suffer, and still you live. Remarkable." He stumbled back, knocking over a bucket of water. The sound echoed sharply against the walls. Frost cursed, reached down, and left the iron unattended on the small wooden table where he kept his tools. For several seconds, he was distracted, trying to retrieve the bucket from the floor. Tobias's eyes flicked toward the iron, cooling, glowing faintly red. He could feel its heat from where he stood. It was the first time in 7 years the weapon had been within his reach. He didn't move. Not yet. Instead, he watched. He memorized the distance, the angle, the height of the table. He memorized the smell, the faint hiss of metal cooling against damp wood. Frost retrieved his bucket, oblivious, and left soon after. The door closed, the latch clicked, and Tobias was once more alone. But now, the world inside his mind had changed. The sight of that iron within reach had transformed thought into certainty. The plan, once theoretical, had become inevitable. That night, as rain began to whisper against the roof, Tobias pressed his forehead against the cold stone and whispered something he had not spoken aloud in years. Soon, the word vanished into the dark, but its echo filled the room like the promise of thunder. The storm was coming not just in the sky, but in the heart of the man they thought they had broken. By the 7th summer of Tobias's captivity, the world beyond the smokehouse had become both strange and familiar to him. The plantation changed faces the way seasons changed colors. Yet for him, time existed in a kind of suspended loop, measured not in months or harvests, but in the deepening creak of the chains and the slow corrosion of the wall ring that held him fast. Outside, boys who had been children when he was captured had grown into field hands. Overseers had grown older, slower, heavier. But inside the smokehouse, Tobias endured, an unmoving constant in a world that mistook his silence for defeat. The overseers no longer visited him with the same enthusiasm they once had. The novelty of his suffering had faded, replaced by habit and resentment. Only Briggs still performed his duties with any sense of ceremony. Discipline must be maintained, he told the others one morning when they questioned the need to continue. If the slaves forget the lesson of this one, the whole system falls apart. To Briggs, Tobias was not a man but a living warning. The others indulged the ritual less often. Frost had grown distracted with his philosophical pretensions. Cole had taken to drinking heavily, haunted perhaps by some dim awareness of what he'd become. Porter was showing signs of age, his breath short, his temper shorter. Nash, though now 28, remained trapped between cowardice and pride, always looking for approval that never came. To them, Tobias was an object, a ghost chained to a wall, more memory than flesh. None of them noticed how their own neglect, born of arrogance, gave him the time and space to complete what he had been working toward for years. The chain link at his right wrist was almost ready. Each night, Tobias tested it in silence, careful to move only when the wind howled or rain battered the roof. He could feel the metal's fatigue now, the tiny groan that told him it was weaker than before. The years of slow, meticulous motion had nearly achieved what brute force never could. Another few nights, perhaps weeks, and the link would snap. He had imagined that moment so many times that it had become more vivid than his dreams. The sound of breaking iron, the weight falling away from his arm, the stillness afterward, a silence so complete that it would feel like rebirth. But freedom alone was no longer his goal. Tobias had grown beyond the boy who fled north under the stars. His dreams now were not of escape but of reckoning. He wanted the 5 men to see, not to kill them, not quickly. Death was mercy. He wanted them to understand what it meant to live in darkness, to feel helpless, to exist as he had existed, bound by the consequences of their own cruelty. His plan was not born of madness but of terrible clarity. It had taken shape over years, crystallizing with every brand, every insult, every scream he refused to give them. It was not rage that sustained him anymore. Rage burned too fast. What filled him now was something colder, an iron calm forged by time and purpose. He had learned the forge's schedule. Every dawn, the smith's apprentice lit the coals. By noon, the heat was at its peak. After sunset, when the overseers finished their rounds, the fire was left to smolder overnight. The branding irons remained near the embers, still warm but untended. Tobias knew exactly where they were kept, in a rack near the back wall, beside the tools for shoeing horses. He had seen the rack through the half-open door during countless sessions. He had also learned the habits of his captors when storms approached. Mississippi weather was predictable in its violence. In August, the air grew thick as oil, the sky turning from blue to brass. Thunder rolled far off, soft at first, then closer, each peal longer than the last. On those nights, The overseers gathered in the big house, too fearful of lightning to stay near the open fields. They would drink and talk and wait for the storm to pass. That was when the yard fell silent. That was when the dogs stayed inside. That was when Tobias would move. He began to prepare himself physically for that night. Each day, after the overseers left, he tested the range of his limbs, stretching the muscles that had long since stiffened from confinement. His body resisted at first, the pain sharp, immediate, but he persisted, breathing through it, rebuilding his strength inch by inch. His arms trembled, his legs quivered under their own weight, but the movement felt holy, like prayer. He also began to imagine the sequence, the choreography of his revenge. In his mind, the smokehouse became a stage, the plantation a theater, and the storm his orchestra. He rehearsed the motions silently each night. Break the chain, loosen the neck collar, free the ankles, cross the yard to the forge, arm himself, approach the main house. Each movement was timed to thunder, masked by the noise of rain. In the dark, he whispered to himself not scripture, not prayer, but simple facts. 5 men, 5 irons, 1 night. By the 7th August, the air itself seemed to tremble with the promise of the storm. The sky darkened each afternoon, then cleared again, teasing him. He began to feel the tension of waiting, not the kind that weakens resolve, but the kind that sharpens it to a fine edge. Meanwhile, the overseers continued their routines, oblivious. Briggs grew slower, fatter, his authority no longer absolute. Cole's drinking worsened. He muttered to himself sometimes, as he walked past the smokehouse, speaking Tobias's name like a curse. Frost's philosophical musings had turned into paranoid rambling about fate and retribution. Porter still visited to taunt, but his voice had lost its old power. It cracked when he shouted. And Nash, poor Nash, was unraveling quietly, his youthful bravado eroded by guilt he couldn't name. Once, late one evening, Nash had entered the smokehouse alone. The others had gone to the tavern in town, and the storm clouds were gathering in the distance. He stood before Tobias for a long moment, saying nothing. His hand shook slightly as he held the lantern. Finally, he whispered, "Do you ever think about forgiveness?" Tobias met his gaze without expression. "Do you?" Nash looked away. He left without another word, but Tobias had seen the flicker in his eyes, the doubt, the fear. It was a small victory, but it confirmed what Tobias already knew. Cracks were forming in their unity. They had once been a single organism, 5 limbs of the same cruelty. Now they were fragments, each haunted by his own reflection. When the first true storm of the season finally came, Tobias felt it before he saw it. The air changed that afternoon, dense, electric. The birds fell silent. The trees leaned under the weight of a sky swollen with darkness. By dusk, the first gusts of wind carried the scent of rain and iron, a smell Tobias had always associated with both pain and possibility. He watched through the small barred window as the overseers hurried across the yard, their coats whipping behind them. Thunder cracked somewhere above the hills, and lightning stitched the sky in brief, jagged threads of light. The world beyond the stone walls came alive with chaos. Inside, Tobias waited. The first drops hit the roof, slow at first, then in torrents. The sound filled the smokehouse like drumming. Each impact on the tin roof vibrated through the air, masking the creak of metal as he shifted his wrist. He wrapped the chain around his forearm, drew in a slow breath, and pulled. The weakened link gave a faint metallic cry but held. He rested, waited for another thunderclap, and pulled again, harder this time. The sound of tearing iron was lost in the crash that followed. The link snapped. For the first time in 7 years, Tobias's right arm was free. He moved quickly, methodically. Using the broken link as a crude tool, he began working on the collar at his neck. The years of strain had loosened its anchor in the wall. It came free with a sharp twist. He dropped it silently to the floor. His ankles took longer, the locks rusted, the hinges stiff, but he had time. The storm outside was relentless, the noise continuous. When the final shackle fell away, Tobias stood upright in the center of the room, his entire body trembling from exertion and disbelief. The sensation of being unbound was almost overwhelming. His limbs ached from sudden freedom. His skin prickled with the chill of the rain seeping through the cracks. He stepped toward the door. The handle was familiar, rough wood, worn smooth by the hands of his tormentors. It turned easily. They had not even bothered to secure it properly that night. He opened the door to a world unrecognizable in its violence. Rain lashed sideways across the yard, wind tore branches from trees, and lightning illuminated the plantation in violent flashes. The forge's glow was visible through the storm, an orange pulse in the distance, like the beating heart of some sleeping beast. Tobias walked toward it. The mud sucked at his bare feet, but he moved with purpose. Every flash of lightning revealed something new: the empty stables, the whipping post, the endless rows of cotton bowing under the storm's weight. Each step felt like reclamation, each breath like defiance. Inside the forge, the coals still glowed. The air shimmered with heat and smoke. Tobias reached for one of the branding irons. His hand, steady despite the tremor of adrenaline. The metal was warm, not yet white-hot. He fed it into the fire, watching the color shift from dull orange to fierce red. Outside, thunder rumbled again, shaking the rafters. Tobias smiled faintly, a rare and terrible expression. The time for patience had ended. The storm had come, and so had the reckoning. The forge burned like a small sun in the belly of the storm. Rain struck its roof in a deafening rhythm, steam rising each time the wind forced water through the cracks to hiss against the coals. Tobias stood before the open fire, its orange light trembling across the walls, painting his scarred skin in living flame. For 7 years that heat had been his enemy, the instrument of his torment. Tonight it was his ally. The same glow that once branded him now crowned him in the light of justice. He gripped the handle of the largest branding iron, the one Briggs had favored, shaped in a simple circle, a tool meant for permanence. The wood was slick with old sweat and grease. The metal end was dark, but beginning to pulse with color as he held it deep in the heart of the coals. When the first white sparks danced from its edge, Tobias knew it was ready. Thunder tore the sky open above him. The sound rolled across the fields like a cannon volley, shaking the ground beneath his bare feet. He lifted the iron, watching it shimmer, a molten ghost of everything they had done to him. For a moment he simply breathed, letting the rain-thick air fill his lungs, tasting ash and freedom in the same breath. Across the yard, the great house flickered with lamplight. He could see their silhouettes through the windows, 5 men gathered around a table, cards and bottles between them. They looked smaller now, almost fragile in their careless laughter. The storm muffled their voices, but Tobias imagined the conversation easily enough. Wagers, insults, cruel jokes about the slaves too frightened to move in such weather. He had heard their laughter 1,000 times through the walls. Tonight it would become the sound that announced their undoing. He stepped out of the forge, the red-hot iron hissing as raindrops struck it. Every few seconds, lightning revealed him in full, tall, lean, scarred from head to toe, carrying the very symbol of their power like a torch. He moved across the yard with a steady gait, his body screaming from disuse, yet driven by a will stronger than pain. Each step splashed through puddles that reflected the firelight behind him. The kitchen door of the main house was unlocked, as he knew it would be. No slave would dare enter here uninvited. No white man would imagine one could. Tobias pushed it open and slipped inside. The warmth of the house struck him like a physical thing, the scent of whiskey, tobacco, and roasted meat heavy in the air. Candlelight flickered along polished wood and gilt frames, all the tokens of luxury built on his suffering. From the parlor came the rise and fall of drunken voices. "Deal again," Briggs bellowed. "Cole cheats when the storm's loud. Thinks the thunder hides his lies." Laughter followed, loud and coarse. Tobias moved through the hallway, his bare feet silent on the floorboards. Every muscle in his body ached from restraint, but he advanced like a shadow given flesh. The iron in his hand radiated heat that seemed to pulse with his heartbeat. As he reached the parlor door, he paused and listened. The thunder masked the last of his hesitation. He stepped inside. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The lightning flared through the tall windows, throwing his figure in stark relief, the chain collar still around his neck, the iron raised, the white scars across his chest shining like brands of light. The 5 men froze, the laughter dying mid-breath. "Good evening, gentlemen," Tobias said quietly. His voice was steady, almost polite. "I thought we might continue our lessons." Briggs reacted first, reaching for the fond pistol beside his chair. Tobias moved faster. The heated iron swept in an arc, connecting with the overseer's temple. The smell of burning hair and flesh filled the room as Briggs screamed, clutching his face. Thunder swallowed the sound. He stumbled backward, overturned the table, cards and whiskey scattering across the rug. Cole rose, knocking over his chair. "How did you?" he stammered, but Tobias was already upon him. The iron flashed again, striking across the man's eyes with surgical precision. Cole's scream was higher, thinner, full of disbelief. He clawed at his face, collapsing against the wall. Frost, ever the philosopher, tried to reason. "Tobias," he said, backing away, palms raised. "Listen to me. You don't understand what you're—" Tobias turned the iron in his hand. "I understand perfectly." He advanced until Frost's back hit the mantel. The overseer's reflection quivered in the mirror above it, eyes wide, mouth open as the mantle. Glowing brand filled his vision. Tobias pressed it forward. The iron hissed as it met flesh. Frost's knees buckled, his words turning into raw sound. Porter lunged with a knife drawn from his boot. Years ago, Tobias might have faltered. Now he pivoted with fluid precision. The blade grazed his ribs, but his free hand seized Porter's wrist and twisted until bones snapped. The knife clattered to the floor. Tobias drove the iron upward into the man's face. The room flared with the smell of scorched skin. Only Nash remained. The youngest overseer stood frozen in the far corner, his lips trembling. Rain hammered the windows behind him, each flash of lightning revealing the terror etched across his features. "Please," he whispered. "I never wanted." Tobias took a step closer. The iron, still glowing though dimmer now, cast red light between them. "You wanted to belong," Tobias said, "and so you learned cruelty." Nash shook his head, tears mixing with the rain that leaked through the broken window pane. "Forgive me. Please, Tobias. I'm begging you." Tobias hesitated. For an instant, he saw the boy Nash had been the frightened apprentice who had once flinched at Briggs's barked orders. For the briefest heartbeat, he felt the ghost of pity. Then he remembered the burns carved into his ribs, the nights without sleep, the years of humiliation. He lifted the iron. "I will." And he brought it down, gently but decisively, against Nash's eyes. The storm's fury reached its peak outside. The thunder roared so loud the walls shook. Lightning filled the room with white fire, freezing the scene in perfect tableau. 5 men writhing, clutching their faces, the air thick with smoke and the acrid stench of ruin. Tobias stood among them, the iron in his hand cooling to black, his breath steady. For a long time, there was only the sound of rain and the broken moans of the blind. He looked around the parlor, the overturned table, the spilled whiskey spreading like blood across the floor, the cards scattered like fragments of judgment. The portraits of the Whitmore family stared down from the walls, their painted eyes impassive, as though watching a sermon rather than a slaughter. Tobias dropped the iron onto the hearth. It struck the stone with a dull clang and lay there steaming. The sound seemed to seal something final. He moved to the doorway, pausing to look back. Briggs crawled toward him blindly, one hand outstretched, the other pressed against the ruin of his face. You can't do this," he rasped. "You're ours. You hear me? Ours." Tobias regarded him with a strange calm. "Not anymore." He stepped into the hall. The house creaked beneath the wind. Somewhere upstairs, a door slammed, perhaps by accident, perhaps by the trembling hand of some servant who had witnessed the unthinkable. Tobias walked on, leaving muddy footprints across the polished floor. Behind him, the overseer's screams faded into the storm. In the kitchen, he paused long enough to take a crust of bread from the table. Hunger gnawed at him suddenly, a reminder that he was still human, still mortal. He ate standing there, the lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating his face, a face transformed not by rage but by release. When he stepped outside again, the rain struck him full in the face. It was cold, cleansing. He tilted his head back, letting it wash over him, over the scars, over the smoke and the blood. For the first time in years, he felt clean. Across the yard, the forge fire still glowed faintly. The path beyond it led toward the swamp, toward the maze of waterways he remembered from his first escape. The dogs would come soon. He could already hear distant barking, faint through the storm. But he did not hurry. He walked slowly, savoring each step as though relearning the act of movement. When he reached the edge of the field, he turned once more toward the house. Through the rain, he could still see the flicker of light inside, dim and uncertain, like a candle struggling against the wind. He imagined the 5 men inside, groping blindly in the dark, dependent now on the mercy of those they had tormented. He imagined their lives stretching ahead, endless nights of blindness and fear, haunted by the memory of the man they thought they'd destroyed. The justice he had delivered was brutal, but it was exact. He whispered a single word to the storm, perhaps prayer, perhaps farewell. Finished. Then he vanished into the rain. Behind him, the plantation lay in chaos. Servants rushed from their quarters at dawn to find the overseers sprawled on the parlor floor, the smell of burned flesh hanging heavy in the air. News spread quickly of the slave who had broken his chains, of the storm that had turned masters into victims. Some called it an act of God, others a warning. No one spoke Tobias's name aloud, but everyone felt it, pulsing through the air like the echo of thunder long after the storm had passed. That night, when the sky finally cleared, the moon rose over the flooded fields, silvering the broken chains still lying on the floor of the smokehouse. Steam drifted from them like breath, and somewhere deep in the swamp, a man moved through the darkness, free for the first time in 7 years, scarred, hunted, but alive. The storm was over, but the world it left behind would never be the same. The storm that freed Tobias became legend before the sun rose again. By morning, the Whitmore plantation was a husk of itself, the great house half collapsed where lightning had struck the roof, its windows shattered, its floors soaked with blood and rainwater. The air was heavy with the smell of burnt flesh and wet wood. The overseers were found crawling in circles, blind, moaning for water, their faces bandaged with torn tablecloths that could not hide the ruin beneath. Briggs, still half delirious, kept repeating the same words over and over. He was fire. He was fire. Word spread across the county before noon. By evening, men on horseback came from neighboring plantations, rifles strapped to their saddles, dogs panting beside them. The idea that a slave had turned the master's own instruments against them lit something deep and vengeful in the hearts of the white men who ruled that land. They gathered at the Whitmore estate beneath a sky still bruised from the storm, their faces pale with disbelief, rage, and fear. Tobias had become an infection that needed cutting out. But Tobias was no longer there. He moved through the swamps like smoke, unseen and uncatchable. The storm's aftermath had transformed the landscape into a labyrinth of water and shadow trees half submerged, creeks overflowing, the earth itself soft enough to swallow footsteps. He waded chest-deep through black water thick with vines, following instinct more than direction. The rain had washed away his scent. The dogs lost his trail within an hour. By the 3rd day, the sky cleared and the heat returned, pressing down with the weight of judgment. Tobias's wounds, reopened during his escape, burned with fever. But he pressed on. He followed the river north, drinking from cupped hands, resting only when exhaustion left him trembling. His body was weak, but his mind was steady, guided by the same purpose that had kept him alive through 7 years of chains. At night, the frogs sang, and the cypress trees loomed like dark sentinels. Tobias found shelter in the hollow of a fallen trunk. He dreamt of fire, of the 5 faces twisting in agony, of the hiss of the iron against flesh. He woke with the taste of smoke on his tongue. Each dawn, he walked farther, but the swamp never seemed to end. Freedom was near, he told himself. He could almost feel it in the air. Yet freedom in Mississippi was a fragile dream. On the 5th day, as he crossed a stretch of dry ground, he saw movement ahead, the glint of metal, the flash of sunlight on water. He crouched low, but the dogs found him first. They came howling through the brush, lean and wild-eyed, their handlers close behind. The first dog leapt. Tobias struck it with a broken branch, but another followed, then another. The men shouted, their voices merging with the dog's snarls. Tobias ran. He tore through the reeds, his breath ragged, mud sucking at his legs. A shot cracked behind him. Bark exploded from a tree near his shoulder. He ducked, stumbled, and fell into a pool of stagnant water. The shock of it nearly stole his breath. When he rose again, a man was already upon him, rifle raised, shouting for him to surrender. Tobias lunged. The rifle went off in the struggle. The shot tore through the man's arm. Tobias struck him once, twice, and ran again, but there were too many. Hands grabbed at him. Fists struck his back. Ropes snaked around his arms. He fought until the world blurred and stars filled his vision. Someone clubbed him across the head, and everything went dark. When he awoke, he was back in chains. This time, they were new, heavier, colder, forged after his escape as if to mock him. His wrists were bound before him, his ankles shackled together, and a long chain connected them to an iron ring bolted into the wagon floor. He lay on rough boards that rattled with each turn of the wheels. 2 armed men rode behind, their rifles across their laps. The dogs trotted alongside, tongues lolling, tails wagging, as though they had performed some noble duty. The road back to the Whitmore plantation was long and bright under the sun. Tobias kept his eyes closed against the light, saving his strength. The men spoke above him, their words dull and distant through the roar in his ears. "Did you see what he did to them?" one said. "Should have killed him on sight," the other replied. "But the judge wants him alive. Wants a show." A show. Tobias understood. The South loved its pageants of power, public reminders of who ruled and who was ruled. His capture was not justice, it was theater. When they reached the plantation, the house had been half rebuilt. The overseers still lived, though their faces were hidden beneath white bandages. They sat together on the veranda like ghosts, blind eyes staring at nothing, the sound of the wagon wheels drawing faint murmurs from their ruined mouths. Briggs stood when he heard the chains clatter. "Bring him here," he rasped. They dragged Tobias before them. The air stank of smoke and lime wash. Flies gathered around the edges of the bandages. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Briggs leaned forward, groping until his hand found Tobias's shoulder. His grip was weak but trembling with fury. "You think you can make us blind," he said, his voice thick with hate. "But you'll die seeing nothing but fire." Tobias said nothing. His silence was the last act of defiance left to him. 2 days later, the trial was held in the town square. The word had spread across counties, drawing planters, merchants, and field hands alike. They came in wagons and on horseback, their faces shining with curiosity and righteous anger. Women held parasols to block the sun. Children perched on fence posts, whispering. The courthouse steps had been cleared for the spectacle. Tobias was brought out under guard, shackled from neck to foot, his clothes in tatters. The crowd hushed as he appeared. Some shouted curses. Others merely stared. A few, especially among the enslaved, lowered their eyes, afraid that even a glance of sympathy might betray them. The judge read the charges: murder, arson, rebellion. Each word fell like a stone. When he finished, he asked if Tobias had anything to say in his defense. Tobias lifted his head. His voice, though hoarse, carried clearly through the air. "I was taught by men who believed pain could make obedience," he said. "I learned their lessons well, and now they live by them." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The judge's face reddened. "You confess, then?" Tobias met his gaze. "I confess that I lived. That was my crime." A murmur passed through the gathered people, part awe, part horror. The judge slammed his gavel. Sentenced to be carried out at dawn. They took him to a small holding cell behind the courthouse. That night, As the town slept, Tobias sat with his back against the wall and listened to the sounds of life beyond a woman singing to a child. A wagon rattling down the dirt road, the distant rustle of trees in the wind. He thought of the river, of the North Star he'd once followed, of the storm that had finally answered him. In the hours before dawn, a preacher came. He was an old man with kind eyes, trembling hands clutching a Bible. "Son," he said softly, "do you wish to make peace with God?" Tobias studied him for a moment, then smiled faintly. "If your God saw all that was done here and said nothing, then he and I are already at peace. We understand each other." The preacher bowed his head. "You have endured much. I have endured enough," Tobias said. "The rest is theirs to bear." When morning came, the sky was pale and still, washed clean by the previous week's storms. The gallows had been built in the center of the square, a rough wooden structure standing stark against the rising sun. The crowd was larger than before. They wanted to see the monster, the fire that walked. As Tobias was led up the steps, a hush fell. The rope hung before him, swaying gently in the breeze. He felt no fear. In truth, he felt almost nothing at all, only the faint hum of the world, the same low note that had filled his ears in the smokehouse for 7 long years. The sheriff asked for final words. Tobias looked out over the crowd. He saw faces, some eager, some horrified, some secretly proud. Among them were men who looked like his father might have looked, women who could have been his mother, children who might someday remember the story differently. "My name," he said slowly, "is Tobias Whitmore. You gave me your name when you bought me. I take it back now. Let the world remember it not as yours, but as mine." And then he stepped forward. The rope snapped tight. The crowd gasped. The sun rose higher. By noon, his body hung still. The people dispersed. The square returned to silence. Only the wind moved, stirring the dust around his feet. But that silence did not last long. In the days that followed, whispers spread of how the sky had darkened as he died, how a single clap of thunder had echoed though the air was clear. Some said his spirit had walked from the gallows at midnight, carrying a burning iron, seeking others who deserved its touch. Others said his final words had become prophecy, that one day, the name Tobias would mean not property, but rebellion. And in the fields, among the enslaved, stories began quiet at first, told in low voices by firelight. Stories of the man who had learned the language of iron and turned it back upon his masters. The man who died unbroken. The white men of Mississippi tried to bury him. But Tobias had already become something that could not die. A symbol, a warning, a beginning. Tobias's body swung from the gallows for an hour after the crowd had gone. The sheriff left it there on purpose, a final message nailed against the sky. This is what happens when a slave forgets his place. Yet even as the rope creaked in the morning wind, the message twisted into something else in the minds of those who watched from shadows and alleys. The enslaved people who had been forced to attend kept their eyes low during the hanging. But later, when the square emptied, some slipped back to stand at a distance. They did not weep. They did not wail. They only stood in silence and looked up at the man who had struck back. For them, the gallows did not spell fear. It spelled proof. A slave had broken his chains. A slave had blinded 5 white men, and he had walked to his death without begging. The town tried to sweep the memory away quickly. Within a day, Tobias's body was cut down and buried in unmarked ground outside the cemetery, where the weeds grew tall and no headstones divided one life from another. The official record noted only, "Executed for crimes against property. August 1857. Property. Even in death, they refused to name what he had been. A man. But records and memory are not the same thing. Back at the Whitmore plantation, the world had shifted in ways no one could quite name. The great house stood, repaired but changed. The new roof did not erase the memory of flames. The scorched patch of earth where lightning had struck remained a black wound in the front lawn. The parlor rugs were replaced, but no amount of soap could scrub the scent of burned flesh from the cracks in the floorboards. Servants avoided the room unless forced. The 5 overseers lived, but they were no longer the men they had been. Their eyes, ruined by heat, had sunk into scarred hollows. White cloth bandages wrapped their heads in permanent shadow. They moved with the fumbling uncertainty of children, feeling along walls, counting steps, depending on others for tasks they once forced others to do. Samuel Briggs, once the tower of strength and fear, could no longer mount a horse. He sat most days on the veranda in a wooden chair, hands gripping the armrests as if the world might fall out from under him. He barked orders still, but they carried less weight. The slaves heard the panic in his voice now, a rawness that had never been there before. They obeyed when they had to, but they listened differently. Marcus Cole, who had once taken such pride in his clever speeches and cutting remarks, found himself unable to navigate even the simplest spaces without help. He lived haunted by sound instead of sight: the scrape of chairs, the creak of doors, the shuffle of feet behind him. Every unexpected noise made him flinch. His words, once smooth and confident, tripped over themselves. He asked the same question over and over. "Who's there?" William Frost, the philosopher of pain, had the hardest fall. The man who had lectured about natural order and proper roles now needed servants to lead him to his meals, to dress him, to hand him his cup. Sometimes he insisted on sitting in the parlor where it had happened, as though he could think his way back into control. He would sit for hours, fingers tracing the grooves in the table, mumbling about fate and consequence. The irony did not miss the house staff. They began calling him the blind prophet among themselves, a title sharpened by bitter humor. James Porter grew meaner. Blindness did not soften him. It worsened him. He snapped at voices, lashed out with his cane, demanded that people announce themselves before they came within arm's reach. But his days of inflicting terror were over. The whip had been taken from him. The first time he swung it blind and struck a white guest instead of a slave, even Master Whitmore realized he could not be trusted with power again. Thomas Nash changed the most. Guilt turned inward in him like a knife. He moved quietly, speaking little, his shoulders permanently hunched as though under a weight only he could feel. He often woke screaming in the night, raving that he could smell metal and hear the hiss of iron. His fear of seeming weak, once the fuel of his cruelty, now left him crushed by his own memories. The plantation's owner, Master Whitmore, saw the overseers not as men broken by justice, but as damaged investments. Their blindness made them useless in the fields, useless on horseback, useless as enforcers. Compassion did not enter his calculations. Within months, all 5 were sold off, each to a different buyer, each at a fraction of the price once placed on their skills. The slaves watched the process quietly. The day Briggs was loaded into a wagon, clinging to the edge with both hands, several field hands paused at their work. He could not see them, but he felt their presence and barked. "Get back to it!" His voice cracked. No one moved. Then, slowly, they turned back to their rows, but their silence was not submission. It was judgment. Whitmore hired new overseers, of course. Cruel men were never in short supply, but they arrived with a new tension in their eyes. They had all heard the story. Before accepting the job, each one had already been warned. This is the place where a chained slave blinded 5 overseers. Careful. They cracked their whips. They shouted. They enforced the same brutal rules. But at night, many slept with lamps burning, unsure if the darkness they feared came from outside or within. The story of Tobias did not stay on the Whitmore land. It traveled along, invisible. Roads passed from one plantation to another by whispers in slave quarters and low voices at river docks. A field hand sold from Whitmore to a neighboring property carried it with him. A housemaid who'd seen the blind overseers leave repeated it to cousins miles away. A boatman, who overheard white men arguing about that damned rebel, told it to dock workers in Natchez. Each retelling sharpened it. In some versions, Tobias broke not one chain, but all of them in a single, thunderous burst. In others, the iron in his hand glowed so bright it lit the whole parlor like daylight. Some said the storm had answered his rage. Others said it had been sent for him alone. A few insisted that, as he stepped from the smokehouse that night, the scars on his chest burned like writing from God. Truth and story wove together until they were inseparable. Far to the north, abolitionist newspapers began printing short notices about a slave in Mississippi who had turned his torturers' tools against them. They rarely used his name, but they wrote of a man who suffered for 7 years and repaid his persecutors in one night. For many white readers, it was a tale of horror, a warning of what cruelty might someday unleash. For others, it was proof that the system they defended was not only immoral but unstable, built on a violence that could erupt in any direction. Among the enslaved, Tobias became more than a man. His story worked its way into songs, into prayers, into bedtime whispers. Mothers rocked their children beside cabin fires and told them that somewhere, a man had refused to break, even when iron kissed his skin every day. Old men stared into the coals and murmured, "He took their sight." The world saw that. The phrase 7 years in chains took on a new meaning. It no longer spoke only of punishment. It spoke of preparation. Whenever an overseer raised his whip and found eyes staring back at him without fear, he wondered just for a moment what those eyes had learned in silence. On the Underground Railroad, conductors began to use Tobias's story as fuel. When fugitives faltered, exhausted and terrified, some guide in the dark would say, "There was a man who could not move from a wall for 7 years, and still he struck back. You can move. Keep going." The knowledge that one of their own had turned the tools of the slave system against itself gave strength to feet that might otherwise have stopped. Plantation owners, too, whispered about Tobias when they thought no one could hear. They spoke of him at supper, over brandy and cigars, their faces tight. He became a warning they passed among themselves. Do not let them read. Do not let them gather. Do not think pain alone keeps them docile. They tightened rules. They increased patrols. They tried to plug the cracks in a dam that was already beginning to tremble. In a way, none of them could see clearly yet. The storm that had broken over the Whitmore plantation had done more than blind 5 men and kill 1. It had stripped away the illusion that the slave system was absolute and eternal. It had shown that even a body chained to a wall could become a threat. Years later, when the first cannons of civil war thundered far to the east, some would remember that earlier storm, the thunder rolling over Mississippi, the lightning splitting the sky above a small stone building, the night when the balance between master and slave had shifted by the weight of a single man's will. On a humid evening not long after Tobias's execution, a group of slaves gathered behind a row of cabins where the overseers could not see. Fireflies flickered like tiny lanterns. An old woman, her hair silver and her back bent, sat on an overturned crate. The children pressed close, eyes wide. "Tell it again," one whispered. "Tell us about the man in the chains." The old woman nodded slowly. Her gaze drifted toward the distant outline of the Desane smokehouse, barely visible in the dark. "His name was Tobias," she began. "They thought they owned him. They thought they owned his body, his pain, even his screams. But there was one thing they could not touch." "What?" a boy asked. "His choosing," she said. "He chose what to do with what they gave him. They gave him fire. He gave it back." The children shivered, not from fear, but from a strange, fierce warmth that rose inside them. Somewhere far away, a whip cracked, a dog barked, a man cursed. Life on the plantation went on, as it always had. But beneath the surface, something had changed. The story had taken root, and once a story like that takes root, even iron cannot hold it. Years passed, and the name Tobias faded from the official records of Mississippi, but never from the mouths of the people. The court documents that had described him as property, executed for violence against overseers, moldered away in courthouses eaten by termites and time. Yet, in the cabins, in the swamps, in the half-ruined churches, where enslaved men and women whispered prayers that mixed scripture with memory, Tobias lived on. His story grew legs longer than chains and walked wherever injustice still ruled. By 1860, on the eve of war, The legend of the slave of the firestorm had traveled as far as Virginia and the Carolinas. Sailors repeated it in ports along the Gulf. Abolitionists quoted it in pamphlets printed in New York and Boston. The details blurred. Sometimes he was called Tobias of the Iron, sometimes the Brander, sometimes simply the man who burned the masters. But the soul of the story never changed. One man, 7 years in chains, 5 blinded oppressors, and a night when lightning itself seemed to take sides. Among the enslaved, his name became both warning and benediction. When overseers grew cruel, field hands muttered, "Careful, or Tobias will come for you." Mothers sang low lullabies that carried double meanings. "Sleep now, little one, and dream of the man who saw through darkness." The song was forbidden in some quarters, though the whites who banned it never understood its words. For the planters, the story was poison wrapped in rumor. It infected them with unease that no sermons or laws could cleanse. They tightened patrols, built thicker walls around their bedrooms, and told themselves that the rebellion of one slave meant nothing. But at night, some woke from dreams where thunder rolled and the smell of burning iron filled their rooms. They would light a lamp, see the comfort of their fine furniture and portraits, and still feel watched. In the North, newspapers reprinted the tale under headlines meant to shock readers into moral clarity. Horrors of slavery in Mississippi. The tortured man who struck back. Ministers thundered from pulpits that God's patience had limits, and Tobias was its proof. "He who sows torment," one abolitionist preacher declared, "shall reap judgment in flame." The words caught like sparks. Within 2 years, as the nation began to crack apart, some soldiers marching under new banners carried small tokens, charms, or folded notes engraved with the single name Tobias. To them, he was not a ghost of vengeance, but a reminder of endurance. Meanwhile, on the Whitmore lands, the remnants of that old world decayed. The overseers, sold away into obscurity, suffered their private hells. Briggs died first, in an Alabama poorhouse, muttering about fire and thunder. Cole lived longer, cared for by a church mission in Tennessee. He often sat by the door and asked passers-by to describe the light. Frost, still obsessed with philosophy, dictated his reflections on the moral order to a nurse who pitied him. The manuscript, never published, ended with the line, "The man I made suffer taught me what it means to see." Porter died in New Orleans, beaten by thieves who did not know who he was. Nash lingered the longest, working as a beggar at a crossroads near Vicksburg. Children threw stones at him, chanting the name he feared most. When he died, someone carved into his tin marker, "Blind by his own hand." By the time war reached Mississippi, the Whitmore plantation had become a ruin. Union soldiers marching through in 1863 found the smokehouse collapsed, its iron ring still fixed in one wall. They used it as a blacksmith post for a few weeks before burning the remaining structures. One of them, a young private from Ohio, recorded in his diary, "Locals speak of a slave once chained here who blinded 5 men. The old people swear the thunder answered him. Strange how truth and justice find their own weather." When the war ended, freedmen gathered near the ashes of Whitmore's land and built a small settlement they called Iron's Rest. At its center, they raised a simple wooden chapel. The altar was made from the stone foundation of the old smokehouse. Above it they hung a cross forged from pieces of broken 12 chain. No one dared claim it was Tobias's actual iron, but everyone acted as if it was. On stormy nights, the congregation said the metal glowed faintly red, as though remembering. The preacher of that chapel, an elderly man named Josiah Green, had been a boy of 12 when Tobias was executed. He had seen the hanging from behind a wagon wheel, and for years afterward had dreamed of the sound the rope made when it tightened. Now, as an old man with freedom written into the law but still contested in life, he told his flock that Tobias's act was not vengeance but revelation. "He showed the world," Josiah said, "that a man's soul can turn the tools of pain into the hand of God. They made him fire. He became light." Every year on the anniversary of the storm, August 15th, the people of Iron's Rest held a gathering. They sang, they prayed, and when thunder rolled over the delta, they said Tobias was walking again, counting the injustices yet unpaid. Children were taught not to fear the sound, but to listen. The sky remembers, their elders told them. It speaks when the earth forgets. After emancipation, as the South staggered through Reconstruction, stories of Tobias merged with the wider folklore of resistance. Former soldiers and freedmen heading west carried the tale to Texas, Arkansas, and even Oklahoma territory. There, it blended with older African myths, the blacksmith gods of heat and justice, the spirits who tempered iron and men alike. Tobias became part man, part legend, a figure who walked through storms with a glowing brand in hand, marking the unjust so that heaven would know them. To some, he was vengeance itself. To others, he was proof that vengeance could serve a holy cause. Academics and ministers tried later to track the origins of the myth. In 1878, a scholar from New England visited Iron's Rest and interviewed the elderly residents. He found fragments, songs, bits of sermon, a charred piece of chain kept in a jar. In his journal he wrote, "They speak of Tobias not as a murderer, but as a redeemer, one who gave vision through blindness. Their theology of justice is forged in the same fire that destroyed their master's eyes." By the century's end, Tobias's name appeared again in print, this time in a volume of Southern folklore compiled by an abolitionist's son. The story had shifted once more. The slave was said to have vanished into the swamp, never captured, his spirit haunting the plantations of Mississippi. The 5 blinded men were said to wander the roads begging for mercy that never came. In these retellings, Tobias did not hang. He simply disappeared, becoming something eternal, a judgment that could not be killed. Time carried the myth forward. When the blues was born in the Delta, some singers wove Tobias into their verses. A 1915 recording of Thunder Walkin' Man began with the lines, "They chained him to the wall, but the wall couldn't stand. He broke the world open with a fire in his hand." Listeners in northern cities who had never heard of the Whitmore plantation felt the story's truth even without knowing its name. Every note carried the rhythm of chains falling. Decades later, during the long struggle for civil rights, activists studying history in dusty libraries found brief references to the 1857 case of Tobias, slave of Whitmore. They reprinted the facts alongside the legend. For them, he was an early voice in the same chorus they now sang, a man who had refused to remain silent under sanctioned cruelty. His image appeared on hand-drawn posters carried in marches, a dark figure holding a glowing iron shaped like a cross. By then, no one could prove the details. The documents were gone. The people who had known him were dust. But the feeling remained. Tobias had become the part of history that lives in conscience rather than books. He was the whisper in every uprising that says, "Endure, but remember, the world had moved on." Yet somewhere, when thunder cracked over the Mississippi River, those who believed in justice could almost see him barefoot, scarred, walking through the storm with quiet purpose. Even in the 21st century, descendants of Iron's Rest gather each August beneath live oaks that shade the site of the old smokehouse. They light candles and sing the old song, slower now but still strong. The words have changed through generations, yet the final line stays the same. He was fire, and fire don't die. In that refrain lives every truth Tobias ever taught, that endurance can become weapon, that suffering can forge justice, that no system built on cruelty stands forever. The man who was once chained to a wall became the measure of freedom's cost, a living reminder that even when a body is destroyed, a story can outlast the empire that killed it. The Mississippi night hums with insects. The river sighs in the distance, and lightning flickers beyond the trees. The worshippers bow their heads as thunder rolls closer, slow and deep, like the turning of the earth itself. Somewhere in the dark, a child asks, "Is that him?" And the elders answer softly, "Yes, Tobias is walking again."